How many of you are saxophonists? Okay. We're in the majority. We're usually in the minority. Majority here. Okay. Raise your hand if you're a non-musician, just out of curiosity. Okay. Well, I guess I could talk a little bit about how we prepared for what you've heard so far. We've been preparing our whole lives for this, right? No rehearsal, but we've been preparing to play this kind of music our whole lives. So essentially, even though, we often, after gigs, particularly non-musicians or students, young students of the music, ask, how did you guys put this stuff together? Well, there are certain things that we all do that's considered standard repertoire, the tunes that we play, standard performance practice. You may have noticed that there was kind of trading when we got to drum solos, and since this was a sax show, I didn't give Adam any trading on it. I just more saxophone sound. But there's a lot of these tunes. We have a form that we work with. It's a harmonic progression, and it keeps repeating. So, like the last tune we have is 32 bars in length. And when we get to the end of it, we start over and we play the whole progression over again. So it just keeps cycling over and over again. So, and these musicians can do all kinds of interesting things within it. So even though we have this kind of box thing that we're working within, it's very malleable. Adam and Bob can change some of the harmonies a little bit. They can get creative. And they're always listening to the other musicians. They're listening to the soloists. They're listening to the other rhythms and different things that the other musicians are playing. So maybe there was something that I played, and then Adam tried to pick up on it, or Bob, or Miles tried to pick up on it. So there's a lot of interaction. Sometimes it's really subtle, and it might blow by a lot of people unless you're really carefully listening. Sometimes it's super obvious, right? So if I go, why don't you answer this? So I'm calling, he's responding, right? It could be as obvious as that, or it could be more subtle. Like I could play an idea, and one of these guys picks up on maybe the harmonic information, which requires a little bit deeper knowledge of what's going on, right? So, but it's malleable. So we can play gigs like this with very little rehearsal, as long as the repertoire does not require a lot of rehearsal, right? If I decided, okay, I'm going to do all original material today, right? And I got all these really weird chords and all this, that's going to require some rehearsal. They might have to listen ahead of time, right? The most that I did for these guys is I told them a list of tunes that we might play. And then last night I emailed 4 charts for some of the tunes that might be a little bit less standard in terms of the harmonic progression and some of the other basic things, right? But the 2 tunes we opened with are pretty standard. I mean, you could go into any club with jazz musicians, and if they didn't know how to play a B-flat rhythm changes, which was the chord progression we just played, well, then they need to go back to the woodshed, because all jazz musicians, that's kind of a rite of passage. That's one of the things that you have to do. And then the first tune we played, which was a minor key blues, you got to have the blues as a background in this music, right? So you have to kind of have a little bit of that together as well. So we could play a lot. We could play these whole 2 hours without any rehearsal, right? Because we kind of know the standard repertoire of this music, and even if we're not completely familiar with certain things, like I said, we've been practicing. The culture of this music is on the ear, and making sure that you listen very carefully to one another and try to interact and recognize. And there are certain things that we play that you could say it is a language. It's not a language in the way that this is a language, where I'm speaking and bringing forth a concept, right? But there's definitely a language. If I play certain things that are part of the language, they'll recognize it and they'll respond accordingly, right? So there is definitely some kind of communication going on in this music, and that's what's great about it. That's what's beautiful about it. So, does anybody have any questions?
Just wondered your setup with your mouthpiece, reed, ligature and stuff.
Yeah. Well, I'm playing a Selmer Mark VI, 1963, and this is literally the horn I started out on when I was a little kid. I'll tell you a brief story. So the day that I guess this is 4th grade that you signed. Is 4th grade is when you start band? 4th or 5th grade. So I showed up, the band director, the first day. If you signed up, you wanted to play in band, you go and they have the smorgasbord of instruments all laid out. It's like, okay, try this one. I didn't want to try any of them because I knew I wanted to play the drums. He told me, well, we've already got too many drums signed up. We don't need any more drummers. So he said, try out a clarinet. I was like, I have no desire to try that. I'm an introverted kid. I'm still introverted. So, I just did what he told me. I played the clarinet. He said, well, try the trumpet. I played that. And then he said, well, try the saxophone. And he said, you have saxophone lips. Which was, I have full lips, but I think it was he was trying to excel at something, right? So, but I came home, I had the sheet sign up, you're playing alto saxophone, and I was mad. I came home and I told my mom, I was like, what a ripoff. So she said, well, your uncle used to play saxophone, and I think your grandparents have one in storage. So they pulled this out of the attic and opened it up, and it was like brand new when, I guess this is, early, mid-'80s, I guess. He got this horn his senior year in high school. My grandparents spoiled him, and his band director said, well, he needs a new horn, and so these were among the best horns in 1963, so they bought him this, and so he played it his senior year in high school, maybe a little bit after he graduated, but it was mothballed until little Jason Swagler started band. And so I can remember the only thing that was the redeeming element of this, even though I was mad playing saxophone, is I loved the look of this thing when I opened up the case. And the smell of it, it still had a little musty smell because it was in storage, but you could smell, I don't know if it's the pads or what. What is it, Mark? You probably know more about this.
It's the smell of a great instrument.
Yeah. So, but it was funny, every time I would send this off to get repaired, there'd be a note in it from some random repairman, because he figured some little kid doesn't know what he has. There'd always be a note in there, I will buy this horn from you. and my band director said, you have a really good horn there, don't let anybody try to buy it from you. So that's how I ended up with this horn. That was longer than I meant to. Anyway, this, the mouthpiece is a Morgan. Frank Morgan, I don't think he's alive anymore. I think he was from Ohio, mouthpiece manufacturer. And there's some students of his that are still, right?
Eric Greifenhagen is still doing his stuff.
But I've played this one off and on for the last 15 years, I guess. Every once in a while I'll go back to what do you call it, the Meyer. But I've played this one for a number of years. I haven't switched since. But I've really only played about 4 different mouthpieces with any kind of regularity throughout my playing life, which has been about 30 years, I guess. So, and haven't changed horns. So I'm not a gear guy. I don't know much. I got to go in here and ask these guys about saxophones and what's out there, because I don't really follow it, because it's a tool to me. I got a decent horn, and it's set up okay, and so I just play it, okay? The reeds, I think this is Frederick Hemke reeds. So, and I play Hemkes, I play Van Dorns and kind of thing. So, and this is probably the most recent thing that I've started to use. Is this weird? Looks like a marching percussion strap or something. Have any of you saxophonists tried these out? The only part I don't like is the fact that it presses against your stomach here. But it makes the horn feel light, super light, and the center of gravity is a little bit different. Like I could never, if I had the horn hanging around my neck, I'd never stand like this. But it distributes the weight so much that you can just stand here comfortably, and you don't even really feel it so much hanging on your shoulders. It's great.
Do you do anything different when you play in a big band?
You mean in terms of setup?
Yeah.
No. No, I keep everything the same. In fact, we did a Jeff St. Louis big band played the Ellington's Nutcracker right before Christmas, and I had to play Johnny Hodges, and I didn't change my setup at all. I played all this. this. So I use this for pop gigs, for jazz. I don't play classical stuff as much anymore, but I'd probably, if I need a darker sound, I would probably change my setup. But for the most part, I keep this. Before this one, though, for a long time, I was playing a Selmer C-Star. Just a regular C-Star classical mouthpiece. I play pop gigs and jazz gigs and everything with it. So, it's just, they're all just tools, you know, as long as you can get it to do what you need to do, you know. And then, you know, when you have discriminating taste about, you know, trying a little thing here, a little different, that's where you start changing your gear around, I think, you know, reeds or mouthpiece. That probably has a bigger effect. Of course, the saxophone will sound, different models sound different. To me personally, I mean, I haven't tried a whole lot of different horns, but when I come here and I try different saxophones, I mean, like I said, I've only played Mark 6s my entire life, and the only other horn that feels to me that's like this is some of the Yamaha models. In fact, one day I was trying out all these horns, and they had an intermediate level Yamaha in here, and that if I needed another alto, I'd probably buy that intermediate Yamaha just because of the feel of it. It just felt really good, you know, and it probably would go out of shape more often because it's not the craftsmanship, you know, the materials are not as high quality as the professional horn.
Different metal, right?
Yeah, different metal. Sometimes it's a little thinner, right? So, but just the feel of it, you know, was good. So, any other questions? Yeah.
You talked a little bit about just listening to and hearing harmony. You could go on with a whole semester course on this, but could you give just a brief encapsulation of how you have practiced listening to harmony, and not just harmony, but linear harmony versus chordal harmony? Because sometimes it's harder to hear the harmonic progressions in a linear fashion than it is in a chordal fashion. And what you do just to practice being able to, or what you did when you were working on it.
Yeah, it's tricky. I think it's really important to have background in some kind of harmonic instrument where you can play chords. Obviously, this is the most obvious instrument. And actually, it's probably the best instrument. Even though guitar is great for certain things, I don't know, there's something about this, the tactile, the visual, and the sonorities you can get. And those of you who work with guitarists, like sometimes I work with just maybe not a pianist, but a guitarist in the band. I mean, it's a different sonic experience in the way that they have to come. It feels like this is more orchestral. Like there are many more sonorities and sounds that could come out of this. So if you know just basic piano skills, just playing chords, that's what I do. I'm not a pianist, but I can play changes. And I've learned as much about harmony and how to approach playing on tunes on that instrument as I have on this instrument. Right? And again, I'm not a pianist. I just use it as a tool. I can play chords and work my way through tunes, you know. And I can play the melodies along with it. Or sometimes I'll sing the melody and I'll play the chords. Or I'll sit at the piano and play the chord and have the sustain pedal down. And I'll marinate in the sounds while playing the saxophone. Right? So I do that. And you can do this too. I don't know how well. Can you just hit the sustain pedal? Some work better than others. But can you hear the piano? It might be hard to hear from there. But the piano I have at home it's like a baby grand, so it comes out much more loudly. So I'll just sit there with the sustain pedal and I'll arpeggiate things, and then you'll hear it almost like you got delay on, and it'll just kind of sit there, and you can kind of mess around. Maybe add a note to it, see what it sounds like.
You can also tune that way too, which is an interesting way, just to put the sustain pedal down, and if you're out of tune, it'll show you pretty quickly. You'll hear it. Yeah. But that, in a nutshell, that's probably the biggest thing is having that added on to your bag of tricks, is having a harmonic instrument that you add to it. And it can start really simple. You can just start with, if you know enough, well, you have to have certain knowledge about harmony when you play this music, right? I mean, some of the early players, they didn't know about a lot of this stuff. They played entirely by ear and played incredibly well. But at some point, even though they say, I don't know anything about it, they did. They just didn't know the nomenclature, the terminology. They learned it completely by ear, but they just didn't have the...
I don't know what this chord is called, but I can play it, right? It's that kind of thing. So it's really getting it in the ear. And it's like anything else, you have to repeat things over, you have to hear things over and over again until they become familiar to you. And then you can do some damage. So listening is really important for that, and for everything, for style, for feel, for sound, emulating. I always have an insatiable desire to find out when I hear something that resonates with me on a recording, and I don't yet know what it is. I have to find that out, because that's my musical personality, you know. And at all levels of, you don't have to be the master of music to do this. You could start from square one. When you hear a recording and something in that recording sounds attractive to your ears, you know, what is that? Part of that is inside you. It's your personality. It's your musical personality. Something is leading you to that sound, right? And to me, I think, you know, some people say, well, you get this book, work out of this book, start with this, and start with that. Sometimes it's hard to really digest some of these things because they're kind of being brought to you, you know, in kind of a forced way. I think we are most ready to hear things that we are attracted to. So when you hear something, like for me, for example, I'll just talk slightly technical here. When I was younger, the sharp 11 on a major 7 chord, before I knew what that was, I started recognizing that as a sound. And I would hear that sound, but I didn't know what it was. And I would hear that, and I was like, that is really cool. And then eventually I finally figured out what that was theoretically, and I just started using it. I never really practiced it as a method. It just started creeping into my playing. I was ready to accept that sound. That was a sound, right? As opposed to somebody saying, you should learn your Lydian dominance right now, right? Which, okay, what is that? I don't even know, you know? So I think, you know, being led by the ear is really important for this music, you know, not being led by theory. Use the theory to kind of build your abilities, but be led by the ear more than anything else. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. You talked about like the distribution of weight. Do you have any kind of ideas about like keeping really a relaxed breath, especially like when your solo is getting more intense and maybe things are a little bit climbing? How do you kind of keep yourself?
That's the struggle of my life.
That's
the struggle. I practice that more than anything else. Relieving tension. These lines, as I get older, these are saxophone tension lines. From doing this, from playing a high hard note, right, like that, right. So I've had to practice not, you know, trying to alleviate all of the tension here. And it's surprising how any tension anywhere starts to go elsewhere, right? So even if you have tension in your embouchure, like I've seen a video recently where they're talking about the muscles of the face and how these muscles are connected down here to the neck muscles. So that's going to tense up, and this is going to tense, you know, it just kind of compounds on itself. So, you know, you have to practice it. I mean, some people like myself develop bad habits over time, and as you all know, it's hard to unlearn certain things. And I have to struggle with that. I struggle with that all the time. I practice that more than anything else. It's just relaxing.
Do you center your air more like around your navel, or is it more centered for the diaphragm? Or
I think the most simplest explanation is I think of free blowing and trying to project forward, you know, as if, you know, without any restrictions, you know, as if you never picked up the saxophone before and you don't know, you know. The very first day you pick up a saxophone as a beginner is probably the freest time you ever played the saxophone, because you'll come up, right? It'll sound bad, you know, but all of a sudden, the more you play, you start to learn, like, oh, I got to do this to make this note sound good, and all of a sudden, you've got all these little built-in tensions that you develop, you know, from note to note, especially when you go high in the upper register. On any wind instrument, the high, it's struggle, right? That's part of the appeal of it, too. How hard is it to play the highest note of the piano? But even just thinking about it, it makes this tense up. So I have to practice that kind of stuff. I mean, I literally have to think, I'm going to play the lowest note and then play you know, the altissimo version of that note and not tense up. Right? I mean, that's the story of my life. That's like the main thing I probably work on more than anything else, is undoing things and alleviating tension. So the struggle is very real for all of us.
All instruments.
Any of you saxophonists, raise your hand if you don't deal with tension issues at all. You might not be as accelerated as mine, but I need to talk to you if you don't have if you need to show me the way, because it's tough. Right? So, any other questions?
You were doing some quarter tones when you're above the staff in your solo. Are there certain
High notes?
certain high notes that you use certain keys to lower the pitch instead of changing a complete half step?
Yeah, sometimes I was venting, I guess, using
Yeah.
some false fingerings, they call it, where you vent. And sometimes it may seem like I'm using a certain fingering, but it's actually happening in here, right? So like, right, I can go down as far as like the inner, I can go down this far on one note. Right? So there's a lot of manipulation that you can do even without changing the fingerings on the saxophone. And for you, if you can't do that as a saxophonist, that's an important thing to practice, is to have that flexibility. Without going into detail, I mean, it's some of it is embouchure, but a lot of it is what we call the voicing. It's kind of your tongue position and how things are positioned in your mouth, basically, your jaw.
So you weren't using any fingers necessarily?
There were certain fingerings, but I wasn't doing anything like any particular tricky fingerings. So some of that, I mean, the only false fingering I recall doing was maybe at the end of Daddy-O. I did, and I'm playing the note and I'm just adding these, so it's kind of giving it a different kind of venting sound, right? So there's a lot of that on the horn. That's using, they call those overtones. That's another kind of effect that you can use on the saxophone. Just different kinds of fingering. So, shall we play another one? Yeah. This is one of those that's not as standard, so they're all pulling out the chart. This is a Herbie Hancock tune. He wrote this, if you recall the movie from the mid-'80s called Round Midnight, that featured the great tenor saxophonist and turned actor Dexter Gordon. This is a tune that Herbie wrote for that soundtrack called Chance. And I think he won an Oscar for this.
he did.
Yeah, for the music. I'll just play.
I guess we could talk a little bit more about this harmonic thing, about learning harmony. Of course, you practice your scales. That kind of stuff. There's traditional, things that you might have in a classical technique book. That's really important to get around the horn. I always tell my students there are 3 major categories that you should practice within. And pretty much everything fits in these 3 little boxes. One is technique. So you learn to work your way around the instrument, right? And that's devoid of style. It has nothing to do with jazz. It's just learning this instrument. And a lot of it is rooted, classical pedagogy, learning an instrument, the tradition in the classical idiom, I hate to call it an idiom, but the tradition of Western classical music, there are many, many years, right? Hundreds of years of trying to figure out how to best organize learning the technique of a particular instrument. And even though the saxophone is not that old, there are a lot of wind instruments much older than the saxophone. The same technique, to a certain degree, applies in terms of just learning your way around the instrument from the fingers to the embouchure, right? And breathing and all of that kind of stuff. So that's one category. You've got a box of technique. Now, as applies to this music or any kind of improvisation-based music, you also have to learn language. So another major category is language. And how do you learn language? Transcription might be the formal way to describe it, but it's literally just being a mockingbird, right? You listen to things and you try to figure out what it is, and you try to repeat it back, right? So that's another major category. And then the third category, regardless of what style of music you play, you have to learn the repertoire of the music, right? So if we call autumn leaves, Bob is not going to say he doesn't know autumn leaves, right? That would be considered a painfully obvious standard that we play in this music, right? So those 3 categories: technique, learning your instrument; language, learning by ear and listening to people who really know how to play this music and imitate them; and then learning the repertoire. Now those 2 categories, repertoire and language, this is how you learn harmony as well, right? Because you can learn the way something sounds when you hear a particular recording. I know for me early on, when I didn't know anything about jazz, I was, like a lot of people, somebody recommended to go to, well, you got to check out Miles Davis' record, that's kind of an entry-level record. It's accessible, and yet it's very deep at the same time, right? And you've got basically things. An all-star band, right? It's the cream of the crop on this recording. And for me, on saxophone, you had John Coltrane and Cannonball Adderley. But I was actually most drawn to Bill Evans. And I didn't realize back then what connected me to that. It's because I love harmony, and I love colors. And Bill kind of comes from kind of the impressionist, romantic. He had a classical background, and with the way that he played the piano, I just loved the sonorities. And so I was drawn early on to Bill Evans, and I probably learned a lot by accident, just because of being attracted to the sound of the way that he played. So I listened a lot to Bill Evans and how he voiced harmonies. And I tried to figure out how, I don't have the technique of Bill Evans, but I could slowly play. I grabbed one of his records. It's called Alone. It's solo piano. And there's a tune on there, and particularly that resonated with me, called Quiet Now. And, I spent a lot of time figuring out how he does what he does on that piece. If you don't know that piece, it has a lot of harmony. It's got a lot of chords, but he plays them rather slowly. And so I felt like I could get a lot of bang for my buck because he's pulling out all of the stuff, in terms of chords and harmony. And I learned a lot away from the horn. And just playing that stuff over and over again, it starts to get into your long-term memory. And then when you pick up your main instrument, whether it's a saxophone, all of a sudden you start to find those sounds on your instrument. You hear somebody play a certain sonority, and it harkens back to what you have in your long-term memory. And you just eventually, if you're lucky enough, if it's really ingrained, you start to find it on your instrument. Right. So to me, it's more important to have it here and in your mind than here. I mean, you can acquire it like, you know, I mean, you could practice that kind of stuff, you know, and play it fast. Like John Coltrane used to play arpeggios really fast, and part of it was so he could hear everything all at once, since we can't play chords, right? So he might go, you know, he might play a sweep of notes together so that you would almost hear it as if it were played all at once on the piano, you know. So that's another way to do it, but I think for me personally, I probably learned more about harmony not so much by trying to play chops on the saxophone and fast arpeggio. I probably learned more about by sitting at the piano again and trying to pick up the similarities and everything. So. Let's see. What do you guys want to hear? Do you want to hear a swinger? Do you want to hear a fast one? Kind of feel and suggestion.
Fast.
Fast. This is, speaking of pianists, this is a composition by a pianist named Kenny Barron, great piano player. It's called Voyage.
very lush harmonies in this one. No bass or anything.
So 10 years ago this year, at SIU, you gave like a masterclass seminar about like the development of like John Coltrane. You had all these really cool recordings from like when he was in the Navy to like the 10-year period where he just continued to improve. So like over the last decade, have you had any kind of revelations about what you've had to do with your practice regimen to like get, really focus and get exactly what you want out of it? Or with constraints of time, getting family, getting kids, getting older.
Yeah, it's a challenge, right?
Or any reflection.
Paper on my lower teeth. I'm talking and it's falling out. Sorry. Yeah, revelation. The biggest revelation for me is I feel like I know what it takes to play like John Coltrane. That's the easiest part of it. Right? The hard part is having the dedication like a John Coltrane to get to the point to where you become John Coltrane, right? I think he was a mere mortal. And those early recordings kind of back that up, right? There are some recordings of John Coltrane before anybody thought of him as a significant musician. In 1945, he was stationed in Honolulu in the Navy, and they had an African-American band, and then they had a white band. And on the kind of the last week before they all headed back to the States, they all kind of got together, both of the bands, and they did some recordings. And so some of those recordings exist, and you can hear John Coltrane in his late teens. I believe he was 19 or 20 years old. And he sounds like a sorry version of Charlie Parker, really. Like you can hear, like there are a couple of licks there, you can hear that he's grabbed from a Parker recording. He's out of tune, he's missing the chord changes. They play a bebop standard, Hot House, as one of the recordings. And he doesn't really sound, you would never guess, even that this is a diamond in the rough. You would just kind of think that this is just a young guy. I mean, I always say, it sounds like one of our less experienced combos at SIU or something like that, right? It's like people who are still kind of developing and don't quite have a concept yet completely. But maybe know a couple licks, that kind of thing. And then 10 years later, he's John Coltrane, John Coltrane. Like in 10 years, from not knowing anything to, well, he knew some stuff, but just kind of being an inexperienced player, to being fully, really not just influencing saxophonists, but he kind of caused a sea change. There aren't a lot of musicians that did that. I mean, Charlie Parker did that. He changed the way everybody approaches their instrument. Louis Armstrong did. John Coltrane did. There are not a whole lot of other guys on that list, musicians, that have done that. And to do that in such a short amount of time. Well, the stories are where Coltrane practiced constantly. He was always working on stuff. Somehow he learned how to learn. He must have been very efficient, and then he did it a lot. So he practiced efficiently, and then he also practiced a lot. So he got a lot more done than the average person, right? And it's easy to say that, and that's all it is, really. I mean, you can have a certain talent for this music, of course, or talent for music in general, but you have to, the hard part is actually through years and years of dedication, getting to the point to where you can become fully realized like that. That's just incredible to me, But again, it's so easy to say, practice a lot, learn how to learn, but go do that now, right? For 10 years, right? It's just incredible, But in the limited experience that I have in terms of coming upon revelations whenever I play and just realize, oh yeah, I feel like this is coming together. I realize that, most of us are never, we don't have that kind of dedication or time, and it becomes even more challenging in the modern day, It's like, as I'm playing, my leg is buzzing, right? I'm getting cued to check something or to dig in, and all of a sudden I'm watching videos of cats on YouTube. It's like, there's so many distractions in the modern world
not that they had it easy then. I mean, they had different struggles, right, in the 60s and 50s and 40s. But this is definitely a new thing that's very hard to. It's amazing. We've got the whole world in our pocket, and yet we've got the world in our pocket. So, you know, it's kind of, it makes it very challenging to just push the world away and get it done. You know? Yeah.
I did hear a comment, listening to KMHD, the Portland Jazz Station, they were interviewing a sax player, talking about how that with YouTube and people studying videos, that it makes it, you know, easier for some students to comp a lot of stuff, but by the same token, they miss the mentorship and the whole other realm of what a real teacher brings.
Yeah, it's almost like it's becoming a dark art in a way, you know, because it's incredible. Like there are kids that I hear from, like most recently I've heard some bands and some musicians in some of the high schools, like in southern Missouri, that you know you'd think that okay, there's not a lot of this kind of, you got to be in the city to catch this kind of musical culture, right? You got to be. I mean, St. Louis is a cow town. We still have like a thriving cultural, you know, thing going on here, and you think somebody out in the sticks is not going to have that. Well, with the internet equalizes certain elements in terms of information, right? And I've been blown away at, you know, at first I don't even know why I asked myself the question, because I hear these kids like, how are you figuring out how to play this way? Well, it's the internet, right? I mean, they're as long as you're getting, I mean, there's a lot of bad information too, right? But as long as you're tapped into, directed into good information, you can find stuff. But again, it's surface level. You know, there are young players. I mean, when I got into college, I didn't know who Charlie Parker was. And now I have kids that come to me, like kids in middle school and stuff, and you know, they've seen videos. I mean, if I'm not that old, but I'm already starting the stories of back in my day, right, with my students, where I'm like, back in my day, if I wanted to see Charlie Parker on video, I had to order a tape from Japan and wait for 3 to 4 weeks for it to arrive, and it was more expensive than the usual video, right? And now it's just like, which video do you want to see right now? Like I can pull it up literally right now. I mean, it's crazy, the information we have now, right? But there's no substitute for, I mean, you still have to pay your dues. You have to play with other musicians, and you have to rub up against musicians who are better than you, that challenge you and inform you. You know, and I always mention with my students that I think St. Louis is kind of unique in a way. If you're fortunate enough to play with a certain circle of musicians here, I think it's something that you can't find necessarily in just every city. And you definitely can't find it on the internet. And believe it or not, there are still things that you can't get on the internet that you can only get by being on the ground and being where it's really happening, you know. And it's really subtle stuff, you know. I say it's cultural, but when I talk about culture, it's like, you know, we all have our own culture, the culture of your family, the way you eat dinner together or not. The culture of where you came from and your roots, the culture of your community, of your, you know. But there's a certain musical culture here that I think is unique because of the different mixes of people that come from this area. You know, that I don't think you can just get that on the internet. But it is incredible. I mean, there are so many more informed young players than there ever has been before.
Can I just jump in here?
Yeah.
Just to reiterate something more towards to you, Kyle, and I think what you're getting at. The more you bump into people above you, the more you realize that, like, as far as talent and intelligence or whatever, you know, these guys don't, they're not necessarily getting smarter or whatever, but they definitely have worked more than you have by that point. It's all work. You can't get around the work, no matter how much information you have, you know, or Charlie Parker videos you watch. There's no faking the work. And, yeah.
Actually, I was going to have a question after you're done that follows up on that. in order to be able to speak, efficiently in the language, to the level that you gentlemen can all speak, like an important commodity has to be put in, and that's time. My question was going to be to anybody, what made you decide to really put in the time? So what still makes you decide to put in that time?
Yeah, you guys know.
Fear of sounding. Not enough of me on.
There's a lot of truth in that, especially saxophonists. I always mention this with students, because who are the go-to guys that people, like the young players are into now? There's like a short list of certain players, and they have a certain kind of technical facility that's pretty impressive, right? Guys like Chris Potter, Ben Wendell, Mark Turner, they're some real technical guys. But Chris Potter in general tends to be one that really gets a lot of people. In my era, it was Michael Brecker and guys like that. And people are still into Brecker, but it's Potter seems to be one that a lot of kids coming in and ask me about. Think of the pressure. There's a lot of saxophonists here, right? But just think, for Chris Potter to come in and do a clinic, he's going to have to blow everybody away, right? He's going to have to pull all, he can't just play a beautiful melody. I mean, he could, but there's going to be a lot of people like, man, he really wasn't doing much today, he didn't go, all over the horn, right? And I'll bet there's a lot of, pressure, momentum that kind of builds upon itself when you're a player like that, to where you know that there's a certain audience that's coming to see that has a certain kind of expectation for you to really push the boundaries of the saxophone, right? And yeah, he obviously has a love for the music and this desire to improve, but then there's also that motivating factor, whether it's fear or just the pressure of my audience. A lot of the folks in the audience are checking out what I can do technically. So that pressure is actually, it works in his favor in terms of just really building his facility on the instrument.
From a practical standpoint, though, one thing that I found, and I'm sure everybody here would agree, is that one thing you can do is just, even if it's for 5 minutes, even if you're tired and you're not really into it, just practice for every day. Be as consistent as possible. Don't let a day go by. Pick up on it somewhere, because chances are you're not going to practice for 5 minutes, and you're not going to be zoned out, and so you're going to go for 30 minutes now.
That's what I was kind of wondering, how's your regimen kind of evolved, efficiency of time and, biggest pitfalls that you found yourself, spinning the wheels, not getting, even though you're spending the time, maybe getting the gains that you want.
Well, I spin my wheels when I'm not organized and I practice it. I'm most efficient when I know what I'm going to do before I practice, right? So I try to organize what it is that I'm going to do. And even if I don't really have I have a regimen, which many of you probably do, there are certain things that like maintenance things that I do, given whatever amount of time I have to practice, I kind of balance that out. But for me personally, yeah, with having a family, the challenge of other kinds of responsibilities, other gigs, things that I have to work on. For me, if I don't practice before 10 a.m., it's tough for me because there's so many things throughout the day that I have to deal with. And I have to play, I'm most effective when I'm not practicing around earshot of anybody. I mean, I want to sound as bad as possible. And so I'm fortunate at my teaching position, I don't have any classes that I have to teach before 10 a.m. So I usually block the mornings off. So if on a good day, I'll be lucky to get like two hours of practice before the day starts. And I'll be playing all day because I have lessons and ensembles. So that's not really practice, but at least that's, I'm glad that I have a job that enables me to do that throughout the day as well. Because that, even just a student brings in a new tune that I'm not familiar with, and all of a sudden it's another thing I have to deal with. So it's kind of practice in a way. But yeah, that's been the biggest factor. Is I have to literally schedule it before when everybody's gone. Everybody's at school and at work, at home, and I can just play as loud, as obnoxious as I can because I know too. So,
You ever pick up the clarinet?
only when forced to. I wasn't fortunate enough. I mean, a lot of saxophonists start on clarinet, and I wasn't fortunate enough to start on clarinet. And I took clarinet lessons, and if the gig is paying really well, and it's not too crazy on clarinet, as a double, not as a clarinetist, but I'll dust it off. But clarinet, I never connected with it, and it's not easy. The break,
It's hard, man.
yeah. You have to practice, and for me at one point, I mean, there's a pressure for saxophonists to double on a lot of things, right? And some people do it really well, and that's what they're into. For me personally, I'm not really into that. And at a certain point, I just decided I don't want to try to fit in that mold because I don't feel like that's me. I love playing flute, and I think I got that a little bit from my wife. She was a classical flutist, and I ended up, when we were dating, I bought her old flute, and she got a new flute. That kind of got me in with her a little bit.
Did you
But
ever
I
play
love
drums?
Yeah, and I have a drum set at home. So
Do you have an opinion on when students should start to double if they're interested in it? I mean, the time frame, how much you want to commit to each instrument?
It depends on the student, and the time frame. I mean, if a student is really struggling on their main instrument, it might be diminishing returns to add yet another thing to throw on top of it. It's really on a case-by-case basis, in my opinion. But if a student is really interested in learning a different instrument, by all means, even if they're just playing a little bit. I mean, for me, on flute, I don't practice it a whole lot, but I play it a whole lot. Like I play it on gigs, especially R&B. I play a lot of R&B gigs, and kind of 70s-ish kind of R&B. And flute works really well for some of that stuff, and it works well. Sometimes I work with female vocalists, and the alto tends to be in a lot of female vocalist range, so it might not be the best choice because I'll be stepping in their range. So sometimes jumping much higher above them with flute works really well. So just playing it a lot, not dealing with the technical hurdle of saying I'm a flutist, just playing it and learning good melodies, and then transferring my knowledge of what I learned on this instrument over to that, is really help. And a lot of times, most of the heavy lifting for doubles is not that great, because those who write, if they know a saxophonist is going to play this clarinet part, they're not, they know that they're not going to write it particularly crazy,
Unless it's Eddie Daniels.
Yeah, unless it's a specialist, a specialist who all of a sudden devotes his life. He used to play tenor. I don't think he plays tenor anymore.
Man, he's a screaming tenor player.
Yeah. My wife has a real bias against flute doublers. She says I can spot them a mile away because they don't own the instrument. I mean, you could just tell. There are a few guys though that really have control of it. But yeah, it's another time-consuming thing. You really have to commit to it if you want to do it really well. And there's a very short list of great doublers who, in my opinion, are also great soloists. It's that old saying, master, how's that say? Jack of all trades, master of none.
Yeah, Yusef Lateef was probably one of the best.
He was great, yeah, he's definitely part of that short list. So.
Dr. Prince, back when he was a doubler, I don't know if he was an old timer, but he could play like 15 instruments and do decent solos like on all of them. It was like a freak of nature.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there are some people out there that can make it all work. I can't. I can't do it. I can't. And even, I play a little bit of tenor. I don't play bari sax anymore. Some guys, don't you play bari and some of the other ones, right?
Yeah.
What's your main? Your main is
Bari.
Is your main? Yeah. Tenor, I'll play from time to time. But this really, it just feels like my voice.
Mm-hmm.
And so I feel like I'm an impersonator on some of the other instruments. And I don't put enough time on the other ones, so I just don't. Shall we play now? What time is it? Begin. one more quick one. If anybody has any questions before we close out? No?
As I say, if you saw a young saxophone player who you thought had a lot of talent, but it gets bogged down with seeing the sea of saxophone players and all the technique and all the virtuosity, what would you say to a person who's just trying to find their place, trying to find their sound, like get them back into not lose hope?
Yeah, it's a challenge. It's a process. The thing I was talking about before, it's really hard, but you just have to have patience. And you really have to push all of that away. I mean, the tendency is always to compare yourself to others. People your age, oh, this person is so much further ahead than me, or whatever, but everybody has a different life experience, and some people really develop rapidly, and then they kind of plateau, and then some people steadily go over time. It's a minor matter thing, and the biggest thing I deal with my students, the biggest challenge is to get them to practice regularly, to practice efficiently, and to have patience, because there are no shortcuts to places worth going, right? And you have to, I mean, this isn't something you can do overnight. I mean, some people can pick up on certain things rather quickly, but everybody needs to have, for the most part, needs to have time, as Juan mentioned earlier. I mean, time is what it's all about, and how you make the most of your time. So that's the biggest challenge, is the mind over matter thing, But when you've got people like,
Saying like everything's already been done, so why? You know what I'm saying?
yeah. Well, has it though? I mean,
Yeah, but it's fighting that mind. You know what I'm saying? But trying to break people out of their own.
yeah. Well, it's tough, but that's the biggest challenge, is to push all of that away. I mean, we all have the tendency, like I talk about to my students all the time. Sometimes musicality tends to go out the window. Like if I'm playing a gig and one of my peers happens to appear in the back of the room, all of a sudden I'm playing for that person, as opposed to the people that pay. The musicians get in for free. So why am I even playing to this guy? He's back there vibing or whatever, right? And then all of a sudden, it's a mind over matter thing. It's the tendency is, okay, now I have to. Yeah. It's funny. Miles, I love the way Miles plays whenever the drummer shows up. He kicks it into high gear. I guess I don't know.
I think you need to have ultimately a goal, levels of goals. Like for a drummer, I guess, and I've said this to everyone, especially guys coming into stuff jazz, you need to think about what's the ultimate gig you'd like to have. I guess instead of just like, I want to be the greatest saxophonist on the planet. That's a little harder to grasp on a daily basis. So, and that changes, especially for me being wanting to always be a versatile musician. It changes. I mean, one day I want to be James Brown drummer, next I want to play with Per Wilco or something like that. So my practice changes for that. For me, professionally, I do a lot of versatile things, so my practice is really about but prepping for the gig, but I try to make that as constructive and scholarly as need be. So I think the goals and the levels of goals.
Do you guys have anything to add?
Short-term and long-term goals.
Very important.
I think in contrast to what Adam said a minute ago about the fear, and I feel that too, but you have to be really in touch with why you're doing it in the first place. You have to be in touch with the joy of making music and the joy of discovery. I discover new stuff every time I play. It seems like because it's limitless. It doesn't end. So you have to enjoy being on that path, despite where you think you're going to get to. It's probably going to take some other turns. So.
Speaking of goals, so I was talking to Sean Jones, who's a trumpet player, and he had, when he was like 21, he had a goal to play lead in the Jazz Living Center Orchestra, and he made a 5-year plan, like a very detailed, down to the day 5-year plan, and he got there in 3 years to be the lead. I mean, he followed it strictly, and it was very meticulous about doing that. Said in 5 years I want to have this job. So in 3 years I'm going to be here, in 2 years, 1 year, this month, this week, today, what I need to do.
Yeah, that's exceptional, right?
That really-
But the reality is, if you practice towards the things that resonate with you, and you keep that momentum, then the opportunities that are in line with where you want to be present themselves. You guys think that's? I mean, if all of a sudden you started playing like klezmer music or something, you're gonna get calls to play that music, right? Because then all of a sudden you're considered the guy that does that kind of stuff, you know. So, and then on top of it, these things where you have responsibilities which build fear, but that pressure it helps them. You get these opportunities that are presented to you, and then all of a sudden it becomes real. My favorite Duke Ellington quote, it's attributed to him, whether he said it or not, it doesn't matter. It's a great quote. He supposedly said one time, "Don't give me time, give me a deadline." If you have all the time in the world, it's easy to do other things. But when all of a sudden you have like a tangible gig, like next Friday, you got to have this stuff together. All of a sudden it becomes much more tangible and real. And fear, motivation, whatever, it works in your favor in many ways, and it helps you to get there in a more tangible and maybe a more realistic fashion.
Yeah, like classical musicians who have good gigs will still take auditions with orchestras would never play in, just to have an audition so that they keep sharp, so that they are working towards something. I know people will do that. Kind of waste everybody's time.
Do you guys have any gigs coming up that you can tell people about?
Bob and I are playing this Thursday at Jazz Bistro.
Oh yeah, the trio with Montez Culver. I've got a faculty recital at SIU February 23rd. February 23rd. Be at the Bistro for a couple things too in February, I think. Band Weather Report. We're doing a tribute to the. It's called Weather Forever is the band. We play. I'm not playing in Weather Report. Wade said
Weather Report.
Yeah. We're doing it's the 40th anniversary, I think, of Birdland and Black Market. Heavy Weather, the album Heavy Weather and Black Market. And so we're doing music for both of those albums on that show.
I got another plug if I can. Every Wednesday, I host a jam session at the Cransburg Arts Center in Grand Center from 7 to 9. It's always free, and all ages are welcome. So everybody here is really part of that at some point, and even people in the audience. So every Wednesday at the Cransburg Arts Center.
Miles. Yeah, that's right. Miles teaches at SIU. Okay, well, thanks so much for sticking around and good questions, and thank you, Mark and Derek, for setting this up. And really appreciate it. I guess we'll close you out with one more picture.